Okay, well, in this lecture, we'll be focusing attention on the European Enlightenment um, to examine kind of the working definition of what the Enlightenment was about as far as its expression was concerned. We'll look at the key influences of the enlightened thinkers themselves, what they were discussing, the types of outlook they had on all aspects of human nature existence, whether it was in the realm of the sciences or in the realm of philosophy, law, literature, um, political philosophy, and other things like that. So it is, in essence, a pretty wide-ranging uh, scope of interest, you might say, that define what the Enlightenment and the Enlightened era was about. Um, in essence, we're talking about a period in time in which there was a broad application of the scientific method to all aspects of human life, combined with a very optimistic sense of individual empowerment through self enrichment. And this lay at the cornerstone of modern life and intellectualism during the age of enlightenment itself. It's in essence where science begins to meet the mainstream, and you arguably, our own approach to daily life, how we begin to categorize, come to understand, and engage with the world around us, even into the 21st century, is predicated on, grounded in an enlightened perspective, the use of reason, um, observation, conclusion, types of practices that get us to a point of that define not only the enlightenment but also define ourselves in a large degree today. As far as context, the scientific method, of course, was using reason and human logic to understand the universe and humanity's place within it. We talked about notions of Niccolo Copernicus, Tycho Brahe, um, and others. Another individual kind of helping to establish the age of science or scientific method was that of Galileo Galilei in the early 17th century, or again 1600s, in which he began to turn attention to the heavens, beginning to study various motions of planets, making astronomical kinds of observations. Um, he would be later in life forced to recant his findings, largely as a result of the Inquisition, the church's crackdown on any type of heretical, uh, proclamations. Which early in the 17th century, Galileo was beginning to espouse and beginning to circulate. And so, as a result, he was brought before the Inquisition and forced to recant his teachings. This is largely as a result of, kind of under duress, you might say. I mean, he was kind of tortured into doing so. By the close of the 17th century, and this is a pretty good example of how far things progress within that one century itself. You have in 1687 Sir Isaac Newton publishing Principia Mathematica. This was his seminal work that identified gravity as the force that held the universe together, basically creating a Newtonian universe. And it was largely with Newtonian physics, and which he created as a field of math and science. He also created the mathematics of calculus in order to prove his observations and kind of kind of kind of offer up data that would support his view of the heavens in essence and how the universe worked. Um, that would dominate the field up until Albert Einstein in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. So Newton's scientific laws were considered to be universal laws. That is to say that that these were laws that could be um, established or were established not only within the operations of our own solar system, but throughout the universe itself. In many respects, through aspects of kind of Newtonian's Newton's perspective, and actually the perspective of many enlightened thinkers, there was this idea, this underlying assumption, or kind of principle that nature was, in essence, the manifestation of a large machine, established by God. And very quickly, with the coming of the Renaissance, oh, excuse me, with the coming of the Enlightenment, this begins to spread into and be broken out into various fields to apply uh, universal laws not only to the motions of the heavens and the astronomy, but also to politics, economics, justice, religion. So this was a systemic approach to understanding the natural laws of any and all things in many respects, or universal laws. It's also important to understand that, of course, this comes at a time in European history when there is a ever-growing kind of momentum of global exploration. That there's this physical, intellectual, and philosophical broadening of horizons and understanding when it comes to Europeans themselves. And this is going to help kind of foster, cultivate, and perpetuate, sustain the this kind of intellectual drive of the Enlightened era. So we'll examine how this happened, the key figures of the era, competing philosophies that emerge from this kind of movement, the major influences, and of course the significance of it all. Key happenings are the key happenings of enlightened approaches are happening in particularly two countries, England and France. Now, these the origins, or these two countries, the developments of enlightened ideas are happening and overlapping chronologically, but we'll handle uh, in this lecture, we're going to focus on them from a French or English perspective in many cases. So science was growing and becoming more sophisticated, to be sure, but it needed some help as far as having scientific ideas and principles beginning to be translated in such a way that the public at large could begin to grasp them and harness, you know, what was being discussed in these kind of small closed circles within the, as a result of things like the scientific um, revolution or the scientific method being established. So science needed some PR help, you might say. And the one who really was fundamental in helping to establish that connection was a man by the name of Bernard de Fontenelle. He was the secretary of the French Royal Academy of Sciences from 1691 to 1741. And he understood scientific principles, but he was not necessarily a scientist himself. He was a popularizer of science. He was very good at explaining things in layman's terms. One of the best examples of this came with his publication of known as the Plurality of Worlds, in which he discussed the the kind of scientific principles of astronomy, but he did so in a literary fashion, in a literary form. In essence, presenting and conveying scientific ideas and theories, um, but in the context of two lovers conversing under the stars in kind of a Q&A type of exchange conversation. So in this way, you can really kind of begin to personalize it. You can begin to present, some uh, what were for the day cutting edge ideas, but do it in a way that was very approachable for kind of a broader cross section of literate society in Europe. There's also a growing sense of skepticism that is a part of the enlightened era itself, particularly of religious truths. There was a intensification, or a growing focus on secularization of thought. Again, we can see this being drawn from things like the ideas of humanism dating back to the early Renaissance era. This faith in the human ability to comprehend, a greater degree of things, kind of a self confidence, you might say. One who was particularly kind of skeptical was a man by the name of Peter Boyle, a French Protestant who was highly critical of religious attitudes. Again, a French Protestant in France. You can see from the dates here, mid 17th century to the early 18th century. So he's living during a period of time of, you know, the French absolute kind of approach, the era of, Louis the 14th. And so as a result of that, he's not necessarily going to be he is almost a persona non grata within his own country. Um, and he took issue with kind of overly religious pursuits and perspectives. He was skeptical of things like superstition, religious intolerance, and dogmatism. He believed that these things were, you know, um, unhealthy for not only French society but virtually any society. So he's in opposition to religious conformity at the exact moment in France's national history in which you have things like the Edict of Fontainebleau beginning to crack down on any alternative expressions of Christianity itself. To have Louis the 14th here in his effort to create a monolithic religious order. Boyle was not having any of that. Boyle instead supported religious diversity and toleration. He saw this as beneficial to state affairs, to peaceful coexistence, and therefore kind of the operations, the foundation of a good, thriving society and government. He also began to apply textual textual criticism to the Bible itself. Um, and he was one intellectual among many who began to do this, began to look at the Bible more objectively, and with kind of an intellectual's inquisitiveness as far as beginning to pick apart some of the allegories and experiences and the chapter and verse, of the Bible itself. So skepticism was also aided by the growth in the travel industry. We've covered a pretty good length the kinds of effects that traders, missionaries, medical practitioners, and explorers had on the wider world. And now, because of those experiences, they were beginning to write down what those experiences were. They were beginning to publish them. And as a result, again, this was a further kind of enrichment or perspective that was being brought into the daily lives of the literate quarters of European society. That expansion of contact and knowledge of the wider world, of course, and its cultures, was going to add to this kind of robust developments taking place during the Enlightenment. Specifically, this would be, or it can be seen in the discovery of Tahiti, New Zealand, and Australia, largely as a result of the exploration conducted by James Cook, among others. Cook was a British sea captain. He published a book called Travels, which became a bestseller in Britain. And in his book, he began to um, uh, champion this idea of presenting the simpler life as the better, happier life. This is where we get the early kind of expression of noble savages, that one's closeness to nature was something that was to be admired, and recaptured in many respects or emulated. That the indigenous peoples of these, of the South Pacific were, in Cook's case, were somehow, they had grasped an inner secret or knowledge of, um, the kind of more utopian, um, pursuit of life than, mainstream Europeans. And so some Europeans began to critique, and use these, experiences or these kind of recollections, to critique Western civilization itself and comparing it to others. Um, so what happens when you do that is that you begin to, immerse yourself or begin to open yourself to what was known as cultural relativism, where cultural certainties became less certain, where customs, were more a product of what worked for a given people in a given region. And then there was no kind of, there were many ways, to, succeed or to thrive. And there wasn't simply just one way, a monolithic kind of way, or approach to be, superimposed across all of humanity itself. So there was a less emphasis on a right way of living or a wrong way of living. And so you get into kind of more of this relativist kind of worldview. And for anyone who has traveled, in their own lifetimes, sometimes even today, uh, you know, uh, this can be, um, culturally and spiritually, in some cases, disorienting. That many people during this period of time in the Enlightened era, began to identify Christianity as simply one way to know God, but it was not the only way, especially when they began to come into contact with, non-Western types of philosophy or spirituality. Now, for some, they would double down on, kind of, the ideas and principles of Christianity. So it's not to say that it's, everyone who broadened their horizons had the same kind of, wonder. Some people, kind of re, uh, retract from or are repelled by those kinds of disorienting, potentially disorienting kinds of experiences. But sometimes humanity doesn't react well to that is serves as a source of fear and instability, in a world, that might be perceived as being, something, fearful or kind of anxiety, producing. But at the very least, what it does, this growth of more constant contact with a wider cross section of the world and its cultures, it is going to at least, open up a path to a sense of enlightenment. And this gets us into the rise of individuals, known as philosophes. So philosophes, roughly defined, again, they're intellectuals of the Enlightenment. So think in terms of the day's writers, professors, journalists, statesmen, economists, political scientists, social reformers, those that, uh, begin to publish their ideas, begin to spread their ideas. But again, this would apply to virtually the whole scope of the human experience itself. Philosophes, as far as, social, origins, are really arose from the nobility and the emerging middle class that begins to express itself during this period of time. Again, when we talk about middle class, I mean, most people in contemporary society, especially here in the United States, would consider themselves to be members of the middle class. during this period of time, the early Enlightened era and the Enlightenment itself, the middle class is a very small fraction of the overall kind of social spectrum itself. But these philosophers would be responsible for, in many cases, directing Western civilization in its intellectual orientation. And the epicenter for all of this was Paris, France. And what's interesting here, and I'll probably refer to this again later on in this lecture in its various parts, is that you have almost this paradox occurring where France was going through this absolutist type of political experiment during the age of Louis XIV and such that we talked about in the previous lecture. But it is also the source of some of the earliest expressions of the Enlightenment and enlightened principles. And in many cases, these things are like oil and water. I mean that people, many enlightened thinkers saw what was uh, going on around them in French society, saw kind of the absolute kind of approach to governing, and in many cases, this would serve to as kind of a natural environment in which to begin to champion and espouse contrarian views within that kind of monolithic or absolute kind of political structure. And sometimes that isn't necessarily surprising, that it's almost a reaction to the status quo. So France was at the forefront of the Enlightened era, but it's also important to understand that this was a transnational movement. That is to say, that it affected all of Europe and the New World as these ideas began to spread across the Atlantic to the colonies and the colonists themselves. Philosophers, for their part, wanted to apply or test their theories. Again, a direct influence from the scientific method that was, had been achieved or established in the 17th century. They were advocates for freedom of expression, which again we might take for granted these days. But again, during the 17th and into the 18th centuries, these were definitely not the norm. The amount of freedom, of expression that people had was, you know, was not a right. It was not the status quo was not the norm. And in many respects, again, philosophers are challenging the status quo. However, too much protest could result in backlash from the state itself in many cases, particularly France. This could result in things like the seizure of books. It could also lead to imprisonment of not only the intellectuals and the authors that were writing these works or kind of percolating these ideas and then presenting them to a wider public, but then also publishers, those that were tasked with and had contracts to publish these works and kind of print them and distribute them. And sellers, booksellers, and distributors themselves could stand to be imprisoned as well. In some cases, philosophers could also be exiled from their homeland for what they were saying and the basically kind of challenges they were making to the established norms. So government, especially within absolute um, kind of organizations of government like France, were mindful of these ideas, and they began to take a keen interest in determining what could and could not be published. And so, as a result, what happens is that philosophers themselves began to publish under pseudonyms, or they published their works anonymously. Um, Sometimes the philosophers themselves um, would exile themselves or expatriate themselves, basically removing themselves to places, parts of Europe that were less restrictive, and kind of where governments were more willing to accept kind of critical thinking and assessment. Places like Holland, for example, a very kind of for its day and age liberal state. Again, Holland, the Dutch Republic was a republic. It was not a monarchy, and so you could publish your books. You could publish them in, if you were an expatriate, say from France, you could publish them in your native French language. You could translate them into other languages like English or French, and so your works were really getting out there, even though you had, and you could do so from the safety of a community, a nation that was more had a higher threshold for tolerance, while still kind of beginning to poke, uh, uh, critique, and kind of investigate and um, antagonize, you might say, um, states like more autocratic states like France. Coming up on the almost the end of time, but I'll continue going here. Some authors sought more creative ways of getting around state censorship. Um, for example, when criticizing a government or policies, authors would actually criticize another government or civilization entirely that closely paralleled the actions and experiences of the contemporary society that they wished to critique. And so as a result, savvy readers would know to insert the contemporary state, some cases France, when they were talking about ancient civilizations. So, and we'll see kind of an example of this when we talk about Montesquieu, but in essence, criticizing, say, ancient Persia to get at contemporary French problems. That readers really savvy, again, kind of proactive readers would say, "Oh, Montesquieu here is talking about ancient Persia, but a lot of what he's talking about has a direct application to the experiences of France today." Well, that's by design. Montesquieu wanted that um, connection to be made by the readers, but this was a way without directly criticizing France itself. Um, so, uh, government, for its part, could also ban books or burn them. But in many cases, this would actually do more to boost that book's popularity. And so people pursuing, in essence, what they can't have. Um, it's also important to understand that philosophers disagreed with one another. Um, But again, this is benefiting the movement overall by making it more inclusive and robust, and which is again a cornerstone of the scientific approach to study. That the ideas being bandied about are not simply accepted as the ultimate truth, that there would be a corroboration taking place as far as double checking the data, the work, trying to recreate experiments to make sure that this was it occurred in one place at one time. Does it occur at a different place another time? um, if not, then there's some inconsistency, and that has to be resolved. These are all kind of characteristic of the age of science. It's also characteristic of the age in the Enlightenment as well. So I'm gonna uh, uh, stop here. Let me just add that philosophers are also going to vary as far as radical notions are concerned, which usually become more uh, radical or kind of progressive, you might say, as the generations progress within the uh, enlightened era, um, and the kind of enlightened movement itself. So let me pause things there, and we'll come back in part two.